There is a ghost that haunts the corridors of British power. It is not a ghost of a person. It is the ghost of a memory. Walk through Whitehall on a quiet morning when the fog rolls in from the Thames, and you can almost feel it. The weight of history pressing down on the Georgian facades, the echo of boots that once marched to every corner of the earth. For 300 years, Britain was not just a country, it was an empire. It was the center of a web that spanned the entire globe, a map where the sun never set, a system where goods and money and power flowed from the colonies to London like blood to a beating heart. This memory is deep in the British DNA. It is encoded in the stone and mortar of the city itself. It is in the architecture of Whitehall, where the Colonial Office once directed the affairs of a quarter of humanity. It is in the statues and the squares, generals on horseback, admirals pointing toward distant seas, merchants clutching ledgers that recorded the plunder of continents. It is in the museums where the treasures of Egypt and India and Africa sit behind glass, never returned, perpetual reminders of when Britain took what it wanted and the world could do nothing to stop it. It is in the way politicians speak. Listen carefully to a prime minister's speech, and you will hear the cadences of empire, the assumption of moral authority, the belief that Britain is not just another nation, but a special nation, a nation that invented parliamentary democracy and the rule of law, a nation that civilized the savage world, or so the story goes. The language of exceptionalism is so deeply embedded that most people do not even notice it anymore. It is the water they swim in. Even though the empire ended 70 years ago, the feeling of it never quite went away. The formal dissolution came in pieces, India in 1947, the Suez humiliation in 1956, the gradual retreat from Africa and Asia through the 1960s. The Union Jack was lowered from flagpoles in Nairobi and Singapore and Aden. But the psychological empire, the empire of the mind, that empire remained. The feeling that Britain was special, that Britain was a global player, that Britain did not need Europe because Britain had the world. This was not just nostalgia, it was deeper than that. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of Britain's place in the modern order. It was a refusal to accept that the world had moved on, that new powers had risen, that geography and gravity still mattered. This is the story of how that ghost tricked a nation. This is the story of how a nostalgia for the past destroyed the future. This is the story of the greatest delusion in modern political history, the delusion of global Britain. To understand why Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, you cannot just look at immigration or the NHS or the lies on the side of a bus. You have to look at the map inside people's heads, the mental geography that shapes how a nation sees itself and its place in the world. For 40 years, Britain was a member of the European Union, but it never truly felt like it belonged. From the moment it joined in 1973, after being rejected twice by Charles de Gaulle, who saw Britain as a Trojan horse for American interests, Britain was the awkward member, the rebellious teenager at the family dinner table, always complaining, always demanding special treatment, always threatening to leave. It felt constrained. It felt like a giant tied down by the little people of Brussels. The Lilliputians of Belgium and Luxembourg imposing their petty regulations on the great lion. This narrative was cultivated over decades by a tabloid press that delighted in stories about the EU banning bendy bananas and mandating the shape of cucumbers. These stories were often exaggerations or outright fabrications, but they fed a narrative. The narrative that Britain was being strangled by bureaucracy, that its ancient freedoms were being eroded by foreign technocrats who had never been elected by anyone. The architects of Brexit tapped into this feeling with the skill of artists. Men like Boris Johnson, who had spent years as a newspaper correspondent in Brussels inventing stories about EU overreach. Men like Daniel Hannan, the MEP who spoke in flowing Victorian prose about the Anglosphere and Magna Carta. Men like Nigel Farage, the perpetual outsider, the pub bore made prime time, who stood in front of a poster showing dark-skinned refugees and warned that Britain was being invaded. They painted a seductive picture. They told the British people that Europe was a dying continent. They said it was a museum, old and slow and bureaucratic, a place where nothing worked properly, where the trains ran late and the economies never grew. They pointed to the unemployment in Greece and Spain and said, "Do you want to chain yourself to these corpses?" They said the future was out there, in the dynamic economies of Asia, in the vast markets of America, in the Commonwealth, that nebulous entity, that collection of former colonies that still technically acknowledged the Queen but which had long since moved on with their own lives. They promised that if Britain cut the chains of the EU, it would be reborn. It would be a buccaneering trading nation again, like the privateers of the Elizabethan age, sailing out to plunder the Spanish Main. They called it Global Britain. The phrase was repeated like a mantra, a spell to ward off doubt. They said that countries were lining up to do deals with the UK. They said that German car manufacturers and French winemakers needed us more than we needed them. They said we held all the cards. Michael Gove, the future cabinet minister, stood in front of cameras and declared that Britain had enough of experts. The implication was clear. Trust your instincts. Trust your feelings. Don't listen to the economists with their boring graphs and their warnings. They told you the euro would work, and it didn't. They told you the banks were safe, and they collapsed. Why should you believe them now? It was a beautiful story. It was a story of national destiny. It appealed to something deep in the British psyche, the desire to be free, to be beholden to no one, to stand alone against the world and win. It was Dunkirk and the Blitz. It was Drake defeating the Armada. It was Wellington at Waterloo. It was Churchill's cigar smoke and defiant V sign. But it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the modern world works. It was based on the idea that trade is about friendship, that if you are charming and speak the right language and have tea with the right people, you can negotiate a good deal. That history and culture and shared values matter more than cold economic calculations. But trade is not about friendship. Trade is about power. And trade is about geography. When the votes were counted on that June night in 2016 and the celebrations ended and the champagne went flat, the British government had to face the cold, hard reality of the negotiating table. The euphoria of victory gave way to the grinding mechanics of divorce. They walked into the room believing they were a lion. They quickly realized that without the European Union behind them, they were just a mid-sized island in a cold, dark ocean. An island of 65 million people trying to negotiate with continents. An island that had just burned the only bridge that connected it to its largest market. The first cold shower came from the United States of America. For the Brexiteers, the American trade deal was the holy grail. It was the prize that would make up for losing Europe. It was the proof that Brexit was right. They believed in the special relationship, that phrase that British politicians invoke whenever they want to pretend that Britain still matters in Washington. They thought that because Britain and America shared a language and a history and had stood together in World War II and Iraq, Washington would give London a sweetheart deal. They thought the Americans would treat them like a favorite cousin. But the Americans do not have cousins. They have interests. When Theresa May and later Boris Johnson went to Washington, they found the door was not wide open. It was barely ajar. The Americans were polite, but they were brutal. They have been trained by decades of negotiating with countries desperate for access to the American market. They know how to smile while they twist the knife. They said, sure, we can do a trade deal, but here's the price. We want you to lower your food standards. We want you to accept our chlorinated chicken and our hormone-treated beef. We want our healthcare companies to have access to your National Health Service. We want to be able to bid for contracts in your hospitals. We want to be able to compete for services that you have always considered sacred and untouchable. The British public was horrified. The idea of American companies buying up the NHS was toxic. The NHS is not just a healthcare system in Britain. It is a religion. It is the closest thing the country has to a shared civic faith. People are born in NHS hospitals, and they die in NHS hospitals, and they love it with a fierce possessive loyalty even as they complain about the waiting times. The idea of profit-driven American corporations running emergency rooms and charging for care was an abomination. The idea of eating chlorinated chicken became a national joke, a symbol of everything that was wrong with Brexit. British people started asking, is this what we voted for? To trade our European food standards for American industrial agriculture? But it got worse. The Americans realized that Britain was desperate. And in a negotiation, if the other side knows you are desperate, you are finished. You have no leverage. You will accept terms that you would never accept if you had options. The U.S. trade representative basically told the U.K. to wait. There was no urgency. America had bigger fish to fry. They were renegotiating NAFTA with Mexico and Canada. They were in a trade war with China. Britain could wait in the lobby. Then came the election of Joe Biden in November 2020. Biden was of Irish descent. His ancestors had fled the famine. He wore his Irish heritage openly. He cared deeply about the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, the fragile peace accord that had ended decades of sectarian violence. He saw Brexit as a threat to that peace, particularly the question of the Irish border. He didn't view Brexit as a brave act of independence. He viewed it as a nuisance, a distraction, a self-inflicted wound that threatened to destabilize a part of the world that America had worked hard to pacify. When Boris Johnson visited the White House, he was not greeted as a hero. He was not invited to give a joint address to Congress. He was told to stand at the back of the queue, precisely what Barack Obama had warned would happen if Britain left the EU. That warning had been dismissed as Project Fear during the referendum campaign. Now it was coming true. The great trade deal that was supposed to replace Europe vanished. It evaporated like morning mist. Today, there is no U.S. trade deal. There's not even a negotiation for one. The talks have been quietly shelved. The Brexiteers had bet the house on America, and America had simply shrugged. So the government looked elsewhere. They looked to the Commonwealth, to the old empire. They looked to Australia. Australia seemed perfect. It is a friend. It has a similar culture. The Queen is on the money. They play cricket. They speak English. It seemed like an easy win. The government decided to make the Australia trade deal the proof that Brexit was working. They rushed it. They told their negotiators to get it done fast so they could have a signing ceremony on television, so they could hold up a piece of paper and say, "See, we told you it would work." But speed is the enemy of quality, and the Australians are not sentimental. They are tough negotiators. They learned from the Americans. They saw the British desperation, and they exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The deal that was signed in December 2021 was a total capitulation. The British government agreed to remove all tariffs and quotas on Australian beef and lamb over 15 years. They effectively opened the door for Australian farmers to flood the British market with cheap meat produced on the other side of the planet. Now consider the difference in scale. A British farm is usually small. It is a family business, a few hundred acres. It has high environmental standards because British regulations demand it. The farmers care for the land because their grandparents worked the same fields. An Australian farm can be the size of a small country. They have massive industrial scale. They use helicopters to herd cattle across properties that span thousands of square kilometers. They can produce meat at a fraction of the cost because they have none of the constraints. British farmers were outraged. They marched in Westminster. They said this deal would put them out of business. They pointed out that Australian farmers are allowed to use pesticides and practices that are banned in the UK. They said it was unfair competition, that Britain was undercutting its own industry to score a political point, that the government was sacrificing them on the altar of Brexit ideology. The government didn't care. They needed a win. They needed a piece of paper to wave at the cameras. They needed something to show the voters that Brexit was delivering. But when the economists looked at the deal, when they ran the numbers through their models, the results were pathetic. The government's own assessment, not some biased outside analysis, but the official government impact report, admitted that the Australia trade deal would increase British GDP by 0.08%. Not 8%, not even 0.8%, 0.08%. And that tiny gain would take 15 years to arrive. It was a rounding error. It was pennies scattered on the pavement. The government had sold out its own farming industry for a gain so small it could barely be measured. It was like selling your car to buy a sandwich. It was economic madness dressed up as strategic victory. But the humiliation didn't stop there. The rhetoric of global Britain was colliding with the laws of physics. Economists have a rule called the gravity model of trade. It has been tested and validated across decades and continents. It is very simple. It says that countries trade the most with their neighbors. Trade reduces as distance increases. The closer you are to a market, the more you will trade with it. The farther away you are, the less you will trade, even if that distant market is theoretically larger. This is intuitive if you think about it. It is cheaper and faster to send a truck from London to Paris than to send a container ship from London to Sydney. The truck takes hours. The ship takes 6 weeks. Fresh food does not last on a 6-week sea voyage. Flowers wilt, vegetables rot. Just-in-time supply chains, the intricate networks that keep factories humming and supermarkets stocked, do not work across 12 time zones and 2 oceans. The Brexiteers tried to argue that distance didn't matter in the internet age. They said, "We are a service economy now. We sell financial services and legal services and ideas and software. These things travel at the speed of light through fiber optic cables." Geography is irrelevant, they said. But you cannot eat an idea. You cannot drive a service. A huge part of the economy is still physical stuff. Cars and medicines and machinery and food. And physical stuff needs to move. It needs roads and ports and customs officers. It needs regulatory alignment so that a British plug fits into a European socket. By leaving the single market, Britain had put a wall between itself and its biggest, nearest customers. Before Brexit, nearly 50% of British exports went to the EU. After Brexit, that share began to decline as friction and paperwork made trade harder. Britain was trying to replace a customer next door who bought 50% of its goods with customers on the other side of the planet who bought 2%. The math simply didn't work. You cannot defeat geography. You cannot will away the miles. Then there was the illusion of China. In 2015, just before the referendum, David Cameron had declared a golden era of relations with China. He rolled out the red carpet for President Xi Jinping. They drank beer together in a British pub in Cameron's constituency, a carefully staged photo opportunity meant to show that Britain and China were friends. The plan was that Britain would become China's best partner in the West, that Chinese money would build British nuclear power plants and high-speed railways, that London would be the gateway for Chinese investment into Europe. But geopolitics moves fast. By the time Britain actually left the EU on January 31st, 2020, the world had changed. The mood had turned against China. The brutal crackdown on the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, broadcast live on television, shocked the world. The revelations about mass detention camps in Xinjiang, where 1 million Uyghurs were being re-educated. The growing evidence that the telecom's giant Huawei was a potential vehicle for Chinese espionage, with backdoors built into the infrastructure of the internet. Suddenly, China was toxic. The golden era was dead, buried quietly without ceremony. and Britain was caught in a trap. The United States demanded that Britain ban Huawei from its 5G network. The Conservative Party, which had been cozy with Chinese investment, suddenly turned hawkish. Ministers who had been photographed shaking hands with Chinese officials were now giving speeches about the threat of authoritarian capitalism. It was an embarrassing about-face, but it was necessary. Britain could not afford to antagonize America, not when it was desperate for that trade deal. So Britain banned Huawei. It ripped out the Chinese equipment from its networks at enormous cost. It joined the Americans in the new Cold War against Beijing, and in doing so, it closed off the Chinese market, or at least made it much more difficult to access. So Britain had lost Europe. It had been rejected by America, and it was now in a Cold War with China. The three biggest economic blocs in the world were effectively closed off or difficult to access. This is the definition of isolation. This is what it looks like when your strategy collapses and you are left alone in the middle of the ocean with no lifeboats. And in this isolation, the British government began to realize something terrifying. They realized that they had lost the muscle memory of how to negotiate. For 40 years, all trade deals were negotiated by the European Union. Brussels had a massive team of shark-like lawyers and economists who had spent their entire careers doing nothing but trade negotiations. They negotiated for 500 million people. When they walked into a room with Japan or Canada or South Korea, they had the weight of the world's biggest market behind them. They could demand concessions because they had leverage. They could walk away from a bad deal because they had options. When Britain left, it had to build a trade department from scratch. The UK had folded its trade expertise into the EU bureaucracy decades ago. Now it had to hire consultants from law firms. It had to bring in people who had never done a big international deal before. They were learning on the job, and the countries on the other side of the table knew it. Japan is a polite country, a country that values diplomacy and saving face. But when Britain came asking for a new trade deal, Japan simply said, cut and paste. They said, here's the deal we have with the EU. You can have the same terms, but you cannot have better terms. You are a smaller market now. You have less leverage. Take it or leave it. Britain had to accept. They signed the Japan deal in October 2020 and celebrated it as a victory. The Prime Minister stood at a podium and said this proved Brexit was working. But it was just a photocopy of the deal Britain already had inside the EU. In fact, it was slightly worse because under the rules of origin, Britain could no longer count Japanese car parts as British for the purposes of exporting to Europe. This seemingly technical detail had real consequences for British car factories that relied on parts from Japan. This pattern repeated everywhere. Canada, South Korea, Mexico. Britain was running around the world just trying to replicate the access it had lost. It was running to stand still, and often it was slipping backwards. The New Zealand deal, the Mexico rollover. Each one was slightly worse than what Britain had enjoyed as part of the EU. Each one was a reminder that Britain was negotiating from weakness. The Brexiteers had promised that Britain would be a rulemaker. They said that inside the EU, Britain was forced to follow regulations written by unelected bureaucrats. They said that outside the EU, we would set the standards for the world. We would be a regulatory superpower. Other countries would adopt British standards because they were the best. In reality, Britain became a rule taker, the hard truth that no one wanted to admit. When you are a market of 65 million people dealing with a market of 300 million or 500 million, you do not set the rules. You follow them. If a British company wants to sell to the United States, it follows US rules. If it wants to sell to the EU, it follows EU rules. If it wants to sell to China, it follows Chinese rules. Before Brexit, Britain had a seat at the table in Brussels where the EU rules were made. It could veto things it didn't like. It could shape the regulations. British officials and ministers were in the room arguing for British interests. Now Britain was outside the room with its nose pressed against the glass. It had to follow the rules to sell its goods, but it had no voice in writing them. This is the opposite of sovereignty. This is subservience. This is being governed by laws you cannot change. The delusion of empire was based on the idea that Britain was still a great power. A great power dictates terms. A great power has leverage. A great power can walk away from a negotiation, and the other side will blink first. But the painful lesson of the last few years is that Britain is a medium power. It is a rich country. It has a strong military. It has cultural influence. People around the world watch British TV shows and listen to British music and study at British universities. But economically, it is not a titan. It is not America or China. It is not even the European Union. And the world is moving towards blocks. The US is a bloc. The EU is a bloc. China is a bloc. These giants are fighting for dominance. They are subsidizing their industries. They are protecting their markets. They are using economic power as a geopolitical weapon. In a world of giants, it is dangerous to be alone. The Brexiteers thought they were setting sail on a nimble speedboat that could dart between the container ships. Instead, they cast off from the mothership in a rubber dinghy just as a storm was starting to roll in. Let us look deeper at the psychological aspect. Why did so many people believe the promise? Why did intelligent, educated people convince themselves that Britain could thrive outside the largest trade bloc in human history? It goes back to the maps on the schoolroom walls. For generations, British children were raised on stories of global reach. They learned about the explorers and the conquerors. They colored in maps that showed the British Empire in pink, stretching across every continent. They were told that Britain was the mother of parliaments. They were told that British justice and British trade and British values civilized the world, that railways and legal systems and the English language were gifts that Britain gave to the lesser peoples of the earth. This narrative is deeply problematic, of course. It ignores the violence and the exploitation and the famines and the massacres. It ignores the fact that the empire was built on force and sustained by oppression. But this is not a history lesson. This is about psychology, about the stories a nation tells itself. There is a deep arrogance in the British establishment, a belief that they are smarter than everyone else. They went to Oxford and Cambridge. They studied classics and philosophy. They debate with wit and eloquence. They thought that the Germans and the French were trapped in a rigid system, and that the British genius for improvisation and pragmatism would win the day. They called it the Dunkirk spirit, the idea that Britain is best when it is backed into a corner, when it stands alone against the continent. The same spirit that won World War II would win the trade wars. But trade negotiations are not a war. You do not win them by pluck and courage and stiff upper lip. You win them by having a bigger market and better data and more leverage. You win them by being able to walk away. And Britain could not walk away. It needed these deals too desperately. The government tried to pivot to India. India is the jewel in the crown of the old empire, the most valuable possession Britain ever held. It has a massive growing economy of 1.4 billion people, a burgeoning middle class, a hunger for Western goods and services. A trade deal with India would be a real prize. It would show that global Britain was not just a slogan. The British government sent delegation after delegation to Delhi. They courted Prime Minister Narendra Modi. They emphasized the historical ties, the shared language, the Commonwealth connection. They thought India would be grateful. They thought India would remember the railways and the legal system that Britain had built, even if they had been built by exploited labor for British profit. But the India negotiation exposed another fatal flaw in the global Britain plan: immigration. The Indian government was very clear. They said, "We want a trade deal. We want to buy your whiskey and your luxury cars and your legal services and your education. But in return, we want visas. We want our students and our IT workers and our doctors and our business people to have easier access to the UK. We want mobility." This was a nightmare for the British government. They had won the Brexit vote by promising to take back control of the borders. They had told their voters that leaving the EU would mean fewer foreigners coming to Britain. The Leave campaign had shown images of Syrian refugees and suggested dishonestly that they would all come to Britain unless Britain left the EU. They had whipped up fears about unlimited immigration from Eastern Europe. Now they were being told that the price of global Britain was more immigration, not from white Christian Europeans, but from brown-skinned Indians. The racist undertones were impossible to ignore. Many Brexit voters had voted to reduce immigration from Poland and Romania. They were not going to accept an increase in immigration from India and Pakistan. The government stalled. They made excuses. They said they needed to study the issue. But the truth was, they were trapped between their economic need for trade and their political need to appease voters who wanted the borders closed. They couldn't sign the deal without offering visas, but they couldn't offer visas without betraying their base. The India deal is still stuck in limbo years later. Talks drag on, deadlines are missed. Both sides issue optimistic statements to the press, but everyone knows the fundamental problem has not been solved. Britain wants trade without immigration. India wants immigration with trade. They are negotiating from opposite planets. Everywhere the government turned, the door was locked or the price was too high. And while ministers were flying around the world chasing these phantoms, the real damage was happening at home, in the small businesses, in the unglamorous parts of the economy that do not make headlines, but which employ millions of people. The small businesses of Britain were the ones paying the price for the empire delusion. Imagine a small company in the Midlands that makes specialized car parts, precision-engineered components that go into German and French vehicles. For 20 years, they sold their parts to a factory in Stuttgart. It was easy, frictionless. They put the parts in a box, and a courier took them across the channel. No forms, no taxes, no customs inspections. It arrived the next day. After Brexit, that company faced a wall of red tape. Suddenly, they had to hire customs agents. They had to pay VAT up front, creating a cash flow crisis. They had to prove where every screw and bolt in their product came from, filling out certificates of origin. They had to understand the rules of origin, the Byzantine regulations about how much of a product must be made in the UK for it to count as British, Many of these small companies didn't have the staff to handle this. They didn't have an export department. It was the owner and his wife and maybe a part-time bookkeeper. They tried to figure it out, but it was overwhelming. The German customer got frustrated. They said, "Sorry, this is too much hassle. The shipments are delayed. The paperwork is a nightmare. We will buy our parts from a company in Poland instead. It is easier. One signature and the parts arrive." Thousands of these small relationships were broken. Contracts that had lasted decades were terminated. They didn't make the headlines. They weren't big enough to be on the evening news. No politician gave a speech about them. But collectively, they were the backbone of the economy, the capillaries that kept the blood flowing. This is death by 1,000 cuts. It is the slow erosion of connectivity. It is the quiet disappearance of businesses that no one notices until the unemployment numbers tick upward and the tax revenues decline and the government wonders why growth has stalled. The Brexiteers had a favorite talking point. They said that German car makers would force Angela Merkel to give Britain a good deal. They said, "BMW and Mercedes and Volkswagen sell hundreds of thousands of cars to Britain every year. They need the British market. They will not let Merkel punish Britain. They will lobby her. They will demand that she give us access. They need us more than we need them," they said over and over until it became a mantra. This was the biggest lie of all. It revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how the European Union works. Yes, Britain is a big customer for German cars. British drivers love their BMWs and Audis. But the single market is existential for Germany. It is the foundation of German prosperity. The integrity of the EU is more important to Germany than selling a few thousand luxury cars to Britain. Much more important. The British politicians didn't understand this. They thought everything was transactional. They thought everything was about money. They didn't understand that for Europe, the EU is a political project. It is a peace project. It was created to make sure that France and Germany would never go to war again. It was built on the ashes of World War II. It is about binding nations together so tightly that conflict becomes impossible. The Europeans were never going to compromise the rules of the club just to help a member who had decided to quit. To do so would be to encourage every other country with grievances to threaten to leave unless they got special treatment. It would be the end of the Union. So the UK crashed out of the single market and the customs union. The transition period ended on December 31st, 2020, and the trade friction appeared instantly, like a wall rising from the ground. We saw it in the queues at Dover. Trucks backed up for miles, waiting for customs checks that had never existed before. Drivers sitting in their cabs for 20 hours, sleeping on the highway, their cargo of fresh fruit rotting in the trailers. We saw it in the empty shelves in Northern Ireland. Supermarkets that could not get stock because the paperwork for sending goods from Britain to Northern Ireland had become too complex. Shortages of everyday items because the supply chains had broken. We saw it in the collapse of exports from small businesses. Fish exporters in Scotland who sent fresh shellfish to France suddenly found their product stuck at the border for days. By the time it cleared customs, it was spoiled, unsellable. Their businesses collapsed overnight, but the government kept talking about the Pacific. They applied to join a trade bloc called the CPTPP. It stands for the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It includes Japan, Canada, Australia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and several other Pacific Rim nations. The government hailed this as a triumph. They said Britain was now a Pacific power. They said this proved that Brexit was about looking outward, not inward, that Britain was connecting with the fast-growing economies of Asia. But look at a map. Pull out an atlas and look. The Pacific is on the other side of the world. Britain is about as far from the Pacific as it is possible to be without leaving the planet. The distance from London to Tokyo is 6,000 miles. The time difference is 9 hours. The cultural differences are vast. The economic gains from joining this club are estimated by the government's own analysis to be 0.08% of GDP over 10 years. Again, that tiny number, that rounding error. And to join this club, Britain had to accept rules that were written by others, rules that were designed for Pacific economies. Britain had no say in writing them. It was joining a club where the rules had already been decided. It was, once again, a rule taker, not a rule maker. It was a desperate search for relevance. It was a government trying to fill the hole left by Europe with anything they could find. They were scrabbling around for deals, any deals, no matter how small or how distant, just so they could say Brexit was working. The sad reality is that Britain is geographically European. Its culture is European. Its supply chains are European. Its electricity grid is connected to Europe through undersea cables. Its security is tied to Europe. NATO is a transatlantic alliance, but its European members are Britain's closest partners in defense. Its closest allies speak French and German, not Mandarin and Japanese. Britain is 17 miles from France. On a clear day, you can see the French coast from the white cliffs of Dover. And yet the government was pretending that Britain's future lay in trading with countries that are thousands of miles away across oceans. Trying to deny this geography is like trying to deny gravity. You can pretend you are not European. You can take the flag down from the European Parliament building. You can strike the EU logo from official documents. You can declare that you are no longer bound by European law, but you cannot move the island. You cannot pick up Britain and place it next to Australia. Geography is destiny. The delusion of global Britain was a way of avoiding this hard truth. It was a way of pretending that the last 50 years hadn't happened. It was a way of pretending that Britain could go back to 1950, or even better, to 1850, when Britannia ruled the waves and the world came to London to borrow money and buy goods. But you cannot go back. The empire is gone. The Commonwealth has moved on. India is a rising superpower in its own right. Australia and New Zealand are integrated into the Asian economy. Canada is tied to the United States. The Old Dominions do not sit around waiting for instructions from London. They are independent nations with their own interests and their own alliances. The world has changed, and Britain has not. The tragedy is that Britain actually had a very good deal. Inside the EU, Britain had the best of both worlds. It was part of the biggest market in the world, with frictionless access to 450 million consumers. But it had kept its own currency, the pound sterling. It was not in the Eurozone. It did not have to bail out Greece or Spain. It did not have to worry about the stability of the euro. It was not in the Schengen zone, so it had its own border checks. It could decide who came in and who stayed out. It had a special rebate on its budget contributions, negotiated by Margaret Thatcher in 1984. Britain paid less per capita than almost any other major member state. Britain was the awkward member of the club, but it was a powerful member. It had opt-outs and exemptions and special status. It used the weight of Europe to amplify its own voice on the world stage. When Britain spoke about sanctions on Russia or climate change or trade rules, it spoke with the backing of 27 other nations. It was a force multiplier. British diplomats in Washington and Beijing and Delhi could say, "We represent the European Union, 500 million people, a $5 trillion economy. You need to listen to us." By leaving, Britain threw away that amplifier. It decided to shout alone, and it found that its voice was much quieter than it thought. The shrinking of the kingdom is not just economic, it is diplomatic. It is about power and influence in the rooms where decisions are made. When world leaders meet now, Britain is often on the sidelines. The big conversations happen between Washington and Brussels and Beijing. The G7 meetings, the G20 summits, the climate conferences, Britain is invited. Britain is politely listened to. But Britain is not really consulted on the big decisions anymore. It is a middle power trying to sit at the table with superpowers. We saw this during the Ukraine crisis. When Russia massed troops on the Ukrainian border in early 2022, who led the European diplomatic response? It was Emmanuel Macron, the French president, flying to Moscow. It was Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, talking to Vladimir Putin. They were leading the diplomatic effort. They were the ones trying to prevent war. The British Prime Minister visited Kyiv. He pledged support. He sent weapons. But he wasn't in the room for the key talks. He was a supporting actor, not the lead. The world is ruthless. It respects power. Power is not just military might, it is economic weight. It is diplomatic alliances. It is the ability to shape outcomes. And by voluntarily reducing its economic power, Britain has reduced its diplomatic power. Britain used to be a bridge between America and Europe. It was the transatlantic link. Now it is floating in the middle of the ocean, connected to neither. The illusion is fading now. The sugar rush of the Brexit rhetoric has worn off. The hangover is setting in. The British people are looking at their bills. Energy prices have soared. Food prices are rising faster than wages. Inflation is the highest it has been in decades. The cost of living crisis is biting. People are choosing between heating their homes and feeding their children. They are looking at the crumbling public services. The NHS waiting lists are at record levels. 7 million people waiting for operations and treatments. Ambulances take hours to arrive. Cancer patients are waiting months for appointments. The social contract is breaking. They are looking at the lack of growth. The economy has stagnated. GDP growth is the lowest in the G7. Investment is fleeing. Companies are moving their headquarters to Dublin and Amsterdam and Paris to maintain access to the single market. And they are asking, where are the sunlit uplands we were promised? Where are the amazing trade deals that would make us rich? Where is the global Britain that was going to stride across the world stage? They are realizing that they were sold a fantasy. They were sold a vintage map that no longer corresponds to the territory. The map showed an empire. The territory shows a small island. The shrinking of the kingdom is not just a metaphor. It is becoming a physical reality. When we talk about the collapse of British power, we usually look outwards to the oceans and the trade routes. But the most dangerous fracture is happening right here on the home islands. The delusion of empire did not just isolate Britain from the world, it alienated the nations within the United Kingdom itself. To understand this, we have to look at the map of the referendum again. It was not a uniform vote. England voted to leave by 53.4%, Wales voted to leave by 52.5%, but Scotland voted to remain by 62%. Northern Ireland voted to remain by 55.8%. This stark division tore up the unwritten contract of the Union. For 300 years, the deal was that the four nations were partners in a joint enterprise. Yes, England was the dominant partner. It had the population and the wealth, but it was supposed to be a partnership. The Acts of Union with Scotland in 1707 and with Ireland in 1801 created a supposedly equal union. But in 2016, the English voters effectively told the Scots and the Northern Irish that their voice did not matter, that England would decide and the rest would follow. This was not how the Union was supposed to work. In Scotland, the anger is palpable. You can feel it in the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow. The Scottish people are culturally distinct. They have their own legal system, separate from English law. They have their own education system. They have their own banknotes. They have their own identity, forged over centuries of resistance to English domination. And increasingly, they see their future as a modern European social democracy like Denmark or Norway or Sweden. They look at the Nordic model, high taxes, strong public services, progressive social policies, and they say, that is who we are. That is who we want to be. They looked at Brexit, and they saw a right-wing English project. They saw Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage talking about sovereignty and immigration. They saw nostalgia for empire, and they wanted no part of it. Before Brexit, the argument against Scottish independence was economic. In the 2014 referendum, when Scotland voted by 55 to 45% to remain in the UK, the Unionists argued that Scotland was safer and richer inside the UK. They said that leaving the UK would mean leaving the EU, since the EU made clear that Scotland would have to reapply for membership. It was a powerful argument. Many Scots who wanted independence reluctantly voted to stay because they did not want to lose their European citizenship. But Brexit flipped that argument on its head. Now the Scottish nationalists argue that the only way to get back into Europe is to leave the UK. They argue that the UK is the sinking ship. They say, look at the trade numbers, look at the isolation, look at the economic stagnation. Why should we be tethered to a dying economy in London when we could be an independent nation inside the European Union? The Scottish National Party, which runs the devolved Scottish government, has been demanding another independence referendum. The government in London refuses. They say it was a once-in-a-generation vote in 2014, but you cannot hold a nation against its will forever. If the economic gap between the UK and the EU continues to widen, if the UK continues to decline while Europe prospers, the pressure for Scotland to leave will become irresistible. We could see the end of Great Britain as a political entity in our lifetime. The island of Britain has been unified since 1707. That unity is now in jeopardy because of Brexit. But if Scotland is a slow burn crisis, Northern Ireland is an active fault line, a border that was drawn in blood and which threatens to bleed again. Northern Ireland was created 100 years ago, in 1921, to be a safe haven for British Unionists. The Protestant majority in the 6 counties of Ulster did not want to be part of the new Irish Free State. They wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. So the island of Ireland was partitioned. A border was drawn through villages and farms, separating families. For decades, that border was hard. There were customs posts and military checkpoints. During the Troubles, the sectarian conflict that killed over 3,500 people between 1968 and 1998, the border was a war zone. The IRA smuggled weapons across it. The British Army patrolled it. It was a symbol of division and hatred. The Good Friday Agreement in 1998 brought peace, and one of its crucial elements was making the border invisible. Both the UK and Ireland were in the EU, so goods could move freely. The checkpoints disappeared. The border became a line on a map that you could cross without noticing. This removed one of the irritants that had fueled the conflict. Brexit threatened to bring back the hard border. If the UK left the EU customs union, there would have to be customs checks between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But no one wanted this. The risk of reigniting violence was too great. So Boris Johnson negotiated the Northern Ireland Protocol. It was a compromise. Northern Ireland would legally remain part of the UK customs territory, but it would follow EU rules for goods. There would be checks on goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, but not on goods moving across the Irish border. In effect, Brexit put an economic border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Goods moving from Manchester to Belfast now face customs checks. Goods moving from Belfast to Dublin do not. And here is the supreme irony. Northern Ireland is currently the best performing part of the UK economy. GDP growth is stronger. Unemployment is lower. Why? Because it is the only part of the UK that still has free access to both the British market and the European market. It is the control group in the Great Brexit experiment. It proves that being inside the single market was good for business. It proves that Brexit is the problem, not the solution. This economic reality is slowly shifting the political gravity. Business leaders in Northern Ireland, who used to be staunch unionists, are now looking south to Dublin. They see a booming Irish economy that is fully integrated into Europe. They see Dublin's GDP per capita surpass London's. They see American tech companies setting up European headquarters in Ireland because it offers access to the single market. They see Ireland thriving while Britain stagnates. The dream of a united Ireland is no longer a romantic fantasy entertained only by Sinn Féin supporters. It is becoming an economic necessity. The demographics are changing. The Catholic population is growing and is now roughly equal to the Protestant population. The younger generation has no memory of the Troubles. The memory of the Empire means nothing to them. They see London as a chaotic, distant capital that does not understand them and does not care about them. Under the Good Friday Agreement, the people of Northern Ireland have the right to vote on Irish unification. If a referendum were held today, it would probably still be defeated. But give it another 10 years of economic divergence, another 10 years of Britain declining while Ireland prospers, and the result could be different. So the grand project of global Britain, which was supposed to strengthen the nation, is actually dissolving it. It is pushing Scotland and Northern Ireland out the door. It is leaving England alone. And England itself is fracturing. What about England? Specifically, what about the parts of England that voted most strongly for Brexit? The forgotten industrial towns of the north and the Midlands, the post-industrial wastelands where the factories closed decades ago and never came back, the coastal communities that once thrived on fishing and tourism, but which have been in decline for generations. They were promised that Brexit would be their salvation. They were told that the money sent to Brussels, 350 million a week, according to the lie on the side of the Leave campaign bus, would be spent on them. They were promised a policy called levelling up. It was supposed to spread wealth from London to the regions. It was supposed to build new infrastructure and attract investment and create jobs in places that had been left behind by globalization. But the reality has been a cruel betrayal. These regions used to receive massive funding from the EU. It was called the Structural Fund. It was specifically designed to help the poorest parts of the EU. It paid for new roads and business parks and science centres and community facilities in the most deprived areas of Wales and Cornwall in the north of England. Billions of pounds flowed into these communities over decades. When Britain left the EU, that funding stopped. The British government promised to replace it with something called the Shared Prosperity Fund. But when the numbers came out, it turned out to be less money. Much less. Cornwall, which had been one of the biggest recipients of EU funding, is now receiving significantly less than it did before. The administration of the funding has been centralized in London rather than being decided by local people who know what their communities need. So the very people who voted to kick the system have been hurt the most by the result. They are poorer. Their services are worse. The new jobs haven't arrived. The levelling up was a slogan, not a policy. The car factories they relied on are closing or shrinking. Nissan in Sunderland, Honda in Swindon. The fishing fleets are tied up because the promised bonanza of regaining territorial waters turned out to be worthless if you cannot sell your fish. Most British fish was exported to Europe, and now the friction and paperwork has destroyed the business. The farmers are being undercut by Australian imports, as we discussed. The mining towns have nothing left to mine. The disconnect between the promise and the reality is total. And this leads to a sense of national malaise, a feeling that nothing quite works anymore, that Britain is becoming a shabby, second-rate country, that things that used to function have broken down. You see it in the public services. The NHS was the religion of modern Britain, the closest thing the country had to a shared civic faith, but it relied heavily on European staff, nurses from Portugal and Spain, doctors from Romania and Poland. They came because Britain was in the EU, and they could work freely. They came because the NHS recruited them actively and offered a good life. After the referendum, many of them left. They felt unwelcome. They heard the rhetoric about immigrants. They were tired of being scapegoated. And they had options. They could work in France or Germany or Sweden, so they left. And the NHS started to rot. Today, there are 7 million people on waiting lists. 7 million. Ambulances take hours to arrive. People die waiting. Cancer patients are waiting months for appointments that should happen within weeks. Operations are canceled. The social contract is breaking. The government blames COVID. They say the pandemic overwhelmed the system. But the cracks were there before COVID. Brexit drained the staff, and the staff are the system. You see it in the water. The government, in its zeal to cut red tape after Brexit, relaxed the environmental rules that were enforced by the EU. The result is that water companies are pumping raw sewage into the rivers and the sea. Yes, sewage, human waste, straight into the water. The beaches that used to proudly fly blue flags, the EU standard for clean beaches, are now unsafe for swimming. Children are getting sick. Surfers are developing infections. The government tells people not to go in the water after it rains. In Britain, an island surrounded by water, you You cannot swim in the sea. It is a visceral symbol of decline. A country that cannot even keep its own water clean. A country that is literally drowning in its own shit. And you see it in the brain drain. The young people of Britain are voting with their feet. Applications for Irish passports have skyrocketed. Anyone with an Irish grandparent, and many English people have Irish ancestry, is desperate to reclaim their European citizenship. Applications for French passports and German passports and Portuguese passports from people with even distant connections to those countries have surged. They are looking at a country that feels small and closed, a country that is obsessed with the past, a country whose politics are dominated by old people's grievances about a world that no longer exists. And they are leaving. They are moving to Berlin and Amsterdam and Lisbon. They are moving to Dubai and Singapore and Toronto. They are taking their skills and their education and their ambition and their tax revenue with them. This is the long-term cost of the empire delusion. It is not just about GDP points. It is about hope. A country's future is its young people. If the young people do not believe in the future of the country, if they see no opportunity, if they feel that the country does not want them, the country has no future. Britain is aging. The population is getting older. The birth rate is below replacement. The only thing that was keeping the population young and dynamic was immigration. And now Britain has made itself hostile to immigrants. It has told the world it is closed for business. So where does this leave the lonely island? Britain is now stuck in a strategic no man's land. It is too big to be a tax haven like Singapore or Luxembourg. It does not have the warm weather or the geographic location to be a global entrepot. It is too small to be a superpower like America or China. It is geographically European, but politically estranged from Europe. It is a member of NATO, but no longer a member of the EU. It is in the G7, but increasingly irrelevant in G7 decisions. It is a country without a clear identity or role. It used to be the workshop of the world, but those days are gone. It used to be a financial center, and it still is, but London's position as Europe's financial capital is being eroded as banks and traders move to Frankfurt and Paris and Dublin. It used to be a diplomatic bridge between America and Europe, but it has burned that bridge. The government is trying to pivot. They are trying to talk about AI and tech and green energy and the industries of the future. They say Britain will be a science superpower. But science needs collaboration. Science needs networks. Science needs funding. Science needs researchers from around the world coming together to solve problems. And the investors are wary. They look at the political instability. They look at the fact that Britain has had 4 prime ministers in 5 years: Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak. They look at the chaos and the uncertainty, and they put their money elsewhere. Venture capital is flowing to Germany and France. Research funding is going to American universities. Britain is being left behind in the technologies of the future. The tragedy is that the solution is staring Britain in the face. The solution is obvious to anyone who looks at the situation objectively. The solution is to accept its geography, to accept that it is a European nation, to rebuild the bridges that were burned, to negotiate a closer relationship with the EU, even if it cannot rejoin immediately. Switzerland is not in the EU, but it has negotiated access to the single market through a series of bilateral agreements. Norway is not in the EU, but it is in the European Economic Area and has full access to the single market. There are models. There are ways to be close to Europe without being a full member. But the ghost of empire stands in the way. To rebuild those bridges, Britain would have to admit it was wrong. It would have to swallow its pride. It would have to accept a role as a partner, not a master. It would have to accept that it is a medium power, not a great power. It would have to accept that the 21st century is not the 19th century, and national pride is a powerful drug. It is intoxicating. It feels good to believe that you are special, that you are destined for greatness, that you are superior to others. The Brexiteers would rather see the country poor and sovereign than rich and integrated. They would rather rule over the ashes than serve at the table. This is the psychology of decline. It is the refusal to adapt to the new reality. It is what happened to the Spanish Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Great powers that refused to accept that the world had changed, that clung to past glories while their economies stagnated and their rivals surged ahead. That woke up one day to find they had been left behind. The world is moving on without Britain. The European Union is integrating further. It is building its own army, separate from NATO. It is issuing its own debt, creating a fiscal union alongside the monetary union. It is becoming a superpower in its own right, a geopolitical actor that can stand up to America and China. The United States is pivoting to the Pacific to face China. The great game of the 21st century is the competition between America and China for dominance. Europe is important to America, but it is not the priority it once was. Britain is even less of a priority. The Commonwealth nations are becoming republics and removing the British monarch as their head of state. Barbados did it in 2021. Jamaica is planning to do it. Australia is debating it again. The ties that once bound the old empire together are fraying. The younger generations in these countries see the monarchy as a relic of colonialism. They want nothing to do with it. Britain is drifting. It is floating in the Atlantic, untethered. It has cut itself loose from the continent, and it is being carried away by the currents. The map of the British Empire that used to hang in the classrooms is now just a historical curiosity, something to be studied by historians and argued about by post-colonial theorists. But the map of the future is even starker. It shows a small island off the coast of Europe. An island that chose to cut itself off from its life support. An island that chose memory over reality. The kingdom is shrinking. Its economy is shrinking relative to its neighbors. Its influence is shrinking in the halls of power where decisions are made. Its territory might soon shrink as Scotland and Northern Ireland drift away, leaving just England and Wales as a rump state. And the saddest part is that it didn't have to be this way. It was a choice. A choice made in a voting booth on a rainy day in June 2016. A choice driven by a story about a past that no longer exists. A choice based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Britain's place in the world. The people who pushed for Brexit are not all villains. Some of them genuinely believed in the cause. They believed in sovereignty. They believed in democracy. They believed that Britain was being held back. But they were wrong. They were catastrophically wrong. They promised global Britain. They promised a new Elizabethan age. They promised a Titan bestriding the world. They promised prosperity and influence and respect. But when the fog cleared and the ship sailed away, all that was left was a lonely island. A smaller, poorer, and more divided place than it was before. A monument to the danger of believing your own myths. A warning to other nations about what happens when you let nostalgia drive your politics. The sun has finally set on the British Empire. It set decades ago, but Britain refused to believe it. It kept the lights on, pretending that the party was still going. It told itself that it was still special, still powerful, still relevant. Brexit was the moment when the lights finally went out, when reality could no longer be denied, when the bill came due for years of delusion. And now the long night begins. The hard years of adjustment. The slow realization that global Britain was a mirage, that sovereignty without power is just isolation, that freedom without prosperity is just poverty. The ghost of empire still walks the corridors. You can still hear it in the speeches. You can still see it in the way politicians carry themselves, as if the weight of history gives them authority. But it is fading. Each year it becomes a little more transparent, a little less substantial. Eventually it will disappear completely. Eventually, Britain will accept what it is, a medium-sized European nation with a proud history but an uncertain future. A nation that must work with its neighbors, not against them. A nation that must play the hand it has been dealt, not the hand it wishes it had. But that acceptance is still years away. For now, Britain drifts, alone, diminished, haunted by a memory of greatness that was always more complicated, more brutal, and more fragile than the myth allowed. The shrinking kingdom, the fading empire, the lonely island. This is the price of nostalgia. This is the cost of refusing to let go of the past. The sun is set, the night is long, and the dawn is nowhere in sight. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.